Hello and welcome to This Really Happened, a place where unbelievable, heart-touching true stories come to life. Sometimes surprising, sometimes bittersweet, always real. Grab a drink and settle in. We're about to begin. Henry W. clearly realized that his days were numbered. He was already over 70, and an incurable illness was relentlessly draining his strength. He was a very wealthy man, a descendant of an old noble family. His grandfather, who once owned an extensive estate, did not limit himself to an idle life, but took up shipbuilding. In this field, he achieved outstanding success and amassed a considerable fortune. Although he lost almost everything during the troubled times, his business acumen remained with him. Moving to Europe, he continued his business, becoming a millionaire once again. Henry W.'s father did not publicize his origins, entered university where he studied history, and later taught. His mother was a gifted musician who played in an orchestra. Henry grew up in an intellectual environment, received an excellent education and upbringing. He started as an engineer, but lost his job in the turbulent 90s. Then, displaying his inherited entrepreneurial flair and strictly adhering to the principles of honesty, he built a successful business from scratch. He went into construction, opened a chain of hotels and restaurants in various cities, and acquired and leased real estate. Henry W. couldn't stand dishonest people and profiteers. In business, he relied only on trusted partners and never cheated his clients. Thanks to this approach, he managed not only to accumulate a solid fortune, but also to gain unquestionable authority in business circles. That day, he dismissed his personal driver, deciding to walk home and get some fresh air. However, his heart was constricting anxiously, his breathing sometimes faltered, and the walk brought no relief. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced his chest. He staggered, sank to the ground, and lost consciousness. David was returning from another part-time job. Money was desperately short. He had recently found work as a porter at a small hotel near the station. The pay there was little, but tips somehow supplemented the meagre budget, and funds were vitally needed. In his early 30s, David already had 3 children. He was particularly concerned about the youngest, Lily, who was born with cerebral palsy and required expensive continuous treatment and rehabilitation. David came home utterly exhausted, barely having the strength to eat dinner and collapse into bed, leaving all the childcare worries to his wife Lucy's fragile shoulders. He loved his quiet wife immensely. Lucy never complained, but her haggard appearance, thinness, and paleness spoke for themselves. Perhaps he should look for another job? Deep in somber thoughts, the young man did not immediately notice the elderly man lying motionless near a bench. Passers-by hurried past indifferently, not stopping. Who knew? Maybe he was drunk or under the influence of something else. David approached closer and tried to sit the stranger up on the bench, but he didn't react and didn't regain consciousness. 2 women joined him. With joint efforts, they carefully laid the old man on the bench, placing a bag under his head. The women called an ambulance, while David unbuttoned the stranger's tight shirt collar and tried to find a pulse. Fortunately, the medical team arrived very quickly. Since the man had no identification, David decided to accompany him to the hospital to help with the paperwork. The old man's face seemed vaguely familiar to him. The stranger was hospitalized without identification. David knew nothing about him, but felt genuine sympathy. Everything pointed to a heart attack, and he was worried that the man's loved ones wouldn't find out what had happened. The young man firmly decided to visit the old man as soon as he regained consciousness and wrote down the hospital's phone number. Despite his constant lack of time, David called the hospital daily, inquiring about the elderly patient's condition. The man had heart surgery. 3 days later, he regained consciousness, although he was still very weak. David bought some cookies and fruit and hurried to visit his charge. "Was it you who brought me here?" the patient asked in a weak but kindly voice. "I thank you from the bottom of my heart." They got acquainted. Henry W., as the old man introduced himself, didn't want to worry his family with news of what had happened. His wife and children had gone on vacation, and he didn't want to spoil their trip. The man asked David about his family and work with genuine interest. Henry W. had a pleasant face, and he listened very attentively, so David, without expecting to, shared his pressing problems with him. The hotel where he worked part-time turned out to be well known to Henry W. David complained about the meagre pay and rudeness from the staff. "Henry W., I think I've met you somewhere before, but I can't remember where," David said. "The world is small, anything can happen," the old man smiled, "and I'm sure we'll see each other again. You, in essence, gave me these days. The doctor said a little more delay, and they wouldn't have been able to revive me." "Oh, come now. Any decent person would probably have done the same," David mumbled bashfully. He felt surprisingly comfortable and warm with this old man, as if he were talking to his own father or uncle. "That's the trouble. There aren't many decent people left," Henry W. replied sadly. They parted as good acquaintances, having exchanged phone numbers. 2 weeks later, David was completely stunned to see Henry W. at the hotel. The entire staff was practically on their toes. They were hastily putting everything in perfect order, polishing every handle until it shone. The arrival of the owner himself was an extraordinary event. But the staff were even more surprised when the owner, with a friendly smile, walked directly up to David and shook his hand firmly. David, not at all embarrassed, sincerely inquired about the well-being of his recent acquaintance. The next day, the hotel manager offered David a position as manager, but he refused. He had never had to manage people before. On the contrary, he was used to being constantly yelled at, bossed around, and sometimes openly mocked for his modest clothing. Henry W. had married a young, striking woman several years prior. They had 2 growing sons, whose upbringing was handled by his wife. His wife was denied nothing, led a social life, and loved to travel the world. The relationship between the spouses had long lost its warmth, becoming more formal. His wife returned from trips in high spirits, but preferred to keep quiet about how she had spent her time. Henry W. understood that age was taking its toll, but the lack of emotional closeness was painful. He also had an adult son from his first marriage who lived in the USA. They called each other occasionally. His son was already around 50, had succeeded in business, and lacked nothing. In essence, despite all his wealth, the elderly man felt very lonely. Friends from his youth had long since moved away, and contact with them had ceased. The unexpected help from a completely unknown young man deeply touched him. In David, Henry W. saw genuine kindness, responsiveness, and a certain inner core. He very much wanted to help this worthy young man escape from hopeless poverty. But he didn't know how to do it, as David was clearly not the type to accept charity. Early in the morning, there was a knock at David's apartment door. Standing on the threshold was Henry W., with a heavy bag filled with fruit and sweets for the children. "I decided to visit you and express my gratitude once again," he said with a smile. "Will you offer me some tea?" David introduced the unexpected guest to his wife and children. It turned out the family hadn't even suspected what had happened, and Henry W. gladly recounted how their husband and father had saved his life. Lucy, listening to the story, quietly nodded and repeated that her Davy simply couldn't have acted otherwise, couldn't have failed to help someone in trouble. The children, listening to the story, excitedly declared that their dad was the best and a true hero. It was clear how much the children loved their father. Everyone present was deeply moved, and David himself blushed shyly. The guest was invited to the table. He spread out the treats he had brought, treated the children, praised Lucy for the delicious tea, and even played with the boys' toy cars for a bit. Then Henry W., getting down to business, offered David a job in his company, for now in a manager position, but with clear prospects for career growth. When he named the salary amount, David thought for a moment that he had misheard. He had never seen such money in his life. It was impossible to refuse such a generous offer, and he agreed, although in his heart he didn't believe it was all really happening. Getting ready to leave, the guest, already at the door, extended a business card and added, "Here, take this. Tomorrow you start your new job. Quit all your part-time jobs today. A serious undertaking begins. Now you'll be able to provide for yourself, help your family properly, and get Lily the treatment she needs." "How can I just like that? I don't know how to do anything," David exclaimed, frightened. "Don't worry, we'll teach you." Henry W. smiled kindly. "You'll study for a month, receiving half the salary for now." David agreed, barely comprehending that even this half was several times, many times, greater than all his previous earnings combined. That night, he couldn't fall asleep for a long time due to excitement, while Lucy carefully ironed the collar of his only decent shirt, wanting her husband to look presentable in his new workplace. The next morning, the young man, very nervous and afraid of not living up to the trust placed in him, went to the company's central office. The boss, Henry W., was already there. He personally showed David around the offices, introduced him to the staff as his friend, and expressed his willingness to personally brief him on the business and teach him all the intricacies of management work. The boss enjoyed unquestionable authority, so the modestly dressed newcomer was received very warmly. He was immediately registered in the HR department and even offered an advance to purchase appropriate business attire. Within just a month, David was transformed. In an expensive suit, white shirt, and tie, he looked like a completely different person. The new manager turned out to be remarkably shrewd and incredibly persistent. He eagerly absorbed knowledge, quickly mastered the subtleties of the profession, the procedures for working with documentation, and the rules for interacting with clients. Soon he surpassed many veterans and became the leading manager. David worked tirelessly, often staying late at the office. 2 years passed. David reached significant career heights, becoming the managing director of the entire company. Now he himself was well versed in all matters and didn't require constant consultations from staff. Despite this, he didn't become arrogant, remained simple in communication, and earned the respect of his colleagues. His relationship with the boss grew into a warm, almost familial one. They often visited each other, and their children, being roughly the same age, became friends and enjoyed playing together. Henry W. trusted David implicitly, treating him like his own son. David's family life changed dramatically. He bought a spacious car, acquired a new, much more convenient apartment near work, and hired an assistant for his wife to help with childcare. Most importantly, his youngest daughter Lily received all the necessary treatment and rehabilitation at a specialized center. The illness receded, becoming almost unnoticeable. The girl was already walking confidently on her own. David and Lucy never tired of rejoicing and thanking their involuntary benefactor. One day, Henry W. called the managing director into his office and offered him to take over the full management of the company during his absence. The boss was due to travel to Germany for serious treatment, possibly even heart surgery. David agreed without hesitation. He had successfully substituted for the owner many times before during his business trips. Soon, sad news arrived from Germany. Henry W. had passed away during the operation. The managing director, devastated by the news, made all the necessary work arrangements and hurried home. Tears flowed involuntarily down his cheeks. Lucy was also crying, and little Lily cried with her. She had grown very fond of the kind grandpa. Besides their personal loss, they were worried about the uncertainty. How would the heirs behave? Most likely, David would have to leave the job that had become like family to him. A few days later, David was unexpectedly summoned by a notary for the reading of the will. David had absolutely no idea what connection he could have to his late boss's inheritance. On the appointed day, he appeared at the specified address. Unfamiliar people, as well as Henry W.'s widow, were already gathered in the notary's office. The text of the will stated that the apartment, country residence, and a significant portion of the capital went to his wife and sons. The entire company, including hotels and office buildings, Henry W. bequeathed to the former porter who had given him several extra years of life and now the managing director. According to the deceased's will, only David was capable of preserving and multiplying the work of his entire life. Everyone present, including the widow, had their eyes widen in astonishment. David himself was so stunned he couldn't utter a word. David had always thought that Henry W. had taken him under his wing out of sympathy, and that his career rise was only possible thanks to the boss's kindness. But the fact that the entire company would be left to him as an inheritance was beyond comprehension. The young man left the notary's office as if in a dream, not feeling the ground beneath him, and hurried home. "Lucy, just imagine, I inherited from the boss," David blurted out, barely crossing the threshold. "What inheritance?" Lucy didn't understand immediately. "He left me his entire company, with branches, with everything, to me, a simple porter." "Oh, Davy," Lucy gently hugged her husband, wiping away a tear that had welled up. "You're so talented, so smart. That's why Henry W. valued you. He was a good man." "And I'm incredibly lucky to have you, Lucy," David whispered. They hugged tightly and sat at the table for a long time, drinking tea together. After the will was read, a period of exhausting litigation began for David, lasting 6 months. The deceased's relatives tried to contest the last will, arguing that Henry W. was of unsound mind at the time of making the will, but their arguments found no confirmation. David himself was perhaps ready to renounce the wealth that had fallen upon him, but the notary handed him a personal note from Henry W. In it, the boss explained his decision and strongly urged him not to give in to the provocations of his relatives, who, in his opinion, were capable of ruining the work of his entire life. Only David, as Henry W. wrote, would be able to preserve and continue his projects. When all the legal battles were over, David finally became the full owner of a vast business empire. Thus, one seemingly insignificant act of humanity and kindness fundamentally changed the fate of a simple young man.